Good evening and welcome to Biz in Focus. On behalf of the Newsfirst team, I'm Zeenat Musafir. Joining us this evening is Dr. Bilesha Veeraratne, IPS Research Fellow and Head of Migration and Urbanization Research. Good evening, Bilesha.
Good evening, Zeenat.
So, Bilesha, labour migration has been a topic for many years. How has the pattern in labour migration changed over the past few years?
The pattern in labour migration has changed in many areas. One predominant area of change is the departure statistics. As of recently, the departure numbers have kind of stabilized. Earlier, up to about 2015, we had a growth in departure statistics, but as of recently, the last couple of years, the departure statistics have stabilized, and within the total number of departures also we see a lot of changes. Previously, we had a lot of female migrant workers leaving Sri Lanka for foreign employment, but as of recently, we see more males leaving for foreign employment. But one thing that we still see is the predominant importance of female domestic workers. It still continues to remain important as a occupational group among migrant workers leaving Sri Lanka. And there is a small growing trend in increasing skilled and professional departures, but that's very incipient, at a very incipient stage still. On the other hand, there is also another emerging trend of incoming migrant workers to Sri Lanka also.
How does skilled migration affect the local economy?
To begin with, we have to understand that skilled migrants are very different in terms of their departure from Sri Lanka compared to low skilled or unskilled migrants, because skilled migrants get better paid jobs with better packages, where most often they migrate with their family. So when a skilled migrant leaves, most likely we are going to lose about 3 or 4 people along with them. We hope it's temporary, but what often happens is that along with the skilled migrant, his or her spouse would go, and also young children would go. And when they leave, what happens is they will start schooling in another country, and it's less likely that they will come back. Even though they start off as temporary migrant workers, it's less likely that they will come back to Sri Lanka. So there's a high chance of losing them permanently to the Sri Lankan economy. And on the side of remittances, what happens is, unlike temporary migrant workers, as I said, they leave as a family. So there is less incentive or less need for them to remit back to Sri Lanka, because the whole immediate family has gone along with them. So maybe there's an elderly mother, parent or mother, father remaining that they might want to send remittances. But on the contrary, if low skilled migrant workers leave, they most often leave as single migrant workers, leaving the family behind. So there's a high chance of remittances regularly coming back to Sri Lanka with low skilled migrants. But having said that, we also have to understand that skilled migrants go for better paid jobs. So when they remit, they have a better capacity to send a larger amount of remittances compared to low skilled workers. But the thing is, skilled workers remittances might not be as regular as the low skilled migrant workers remittances. Even though the low skilled remittances is small, we can count on it. It is regular and reliable.
What are your suggestions as an expert in this field to improve these remittances?
So recently we did a study looking at remittance management at the household level in Sri Lanka. So I think these findings are mostly applicable to lower skilled migrants, not to high skilled or professional migrants. So what we found was migration and remittances has a tendency to increase savings and decrease unproductive borrowing in migrant households. So this is a good outcome, and this is at the current status quo, where very little or limited focus is given on remittance management at the household level. We have the Sri Lanka Bureau of Foreign Employment doing some pre-departure training, where migrants and the family members are given a brief introduction about remittance management, and also we have some grassroots level activities done by civil society organizations focusing on this. But I would say there's a lot more we can do, and if we do a lot in terms of remittance management education and information sharing with them, much better outcomes can be achieved, especially because we see in terms of low skilled migrant workers, there's a tendency that these left behind families tend to thrive while the migrant is overseas and the remittance stream is coming. But once the migrant returns to the country, they kind of returns to the state where they were before migration. So that indicates that there is not proper remittance management, that they plan beyond the return of the migrant and to uplift their socioeconomic situation.
So, Bilesha, you spoke of migration, particularly skilled migration, and the positive impacts as well as the negative impacts to the economy. So, how would you, as an expert in this field, suggest the measures that should be taken to encourage the labour workforce to retain the labour workforce in Sri Lanka?
So, Zeenath, in this modern day and age, I think retaining our Sri Lankan workers within our geographic borders is not a realistic ambition, because globalization is taking people beyond geographic barriers. So we have to be open and accept that there are benefits of Sri Lankan workers going abroad, because they acquire skills and expertise, and they get better pay packages, like you said, and then it has a way of coming back to the Sri Lankan economy. So the critical thing is the Sri Lankan economy or the Sri Lankan state has to understand or identify ways where we could keep this link between the skilled migrants going even after they leave Sri Lanka, because we don't want to cut them off just as they leave. Just maintain the ties with them, get them to remit more often, give them some facilities or incentives to remit more often, and also maybe invest, because skilled migrants have ways of investing, and if we have a better infrastructure to attract their investment, that will be good. And also a very important component is remittances is not only financial remittances, there are also social remittances. So social remittances can bring in their expertise, their knowledge back into the Sri Lankan economy and contribute to the growth of the Sri Lankan economy.
When we talk about migration, skilled migration, non-skilled migration, a growing trend is among the youth, especially where they go overseas and find other opportunities. So how would this affect the local labour workforce?
I think right now also the Sri Lankan labour market has shortages in certain skills categories. So when we lose the youth or the young labour force, this shortage would increase in these specific categories. Now, for example, in terms of construction sector, we seem to have a lot of shortages. I think sometimes what we hear from our recruitment agents or people working in the migration field is that some of these young people do not like to do certain types of jobs in Sri Lanka, but they don't mind doing the same thing abroad. So sometimes we hear that people say that they're afraid of heights and they can't climb that many stairs to be in the construction field. But then the same people are climbing like 40, 50 story buildings and doing the construction work. So I think that's to do with the attitude, and also the general perception in the country that some of the skills or some of the occupations are not given the due recognition. So I think if that sort of a recognition is given, we can kind of balance between the labour migration and the local labour demand.
Also, Bilesha, so in your recent study, disparities in receipt of remittances, your recent study highlighted these disparities. Could you further elaborate on these?
Yes, this study found out some interesting facts, because most often we hear about $7 billion or more are coming into Sri Lanka annually as remittances. But very little is known about where it is distributed within the country. So in this study, we looked at the district breakdown of remittances, and of course Colombo got the biggest share of the total remittances as a district, and Western Province also as a province got the biggest share. But one interesting thing that we noted was in this study that we have more households receiving remittances than more households having a migrant worker. That means there are more people sending remittances, most likely there are more people sending remittances to Sri Lanka than the temporary migrant workers that we normally consider to be remitting to Sri Lanka. So I think these could be like permanent migrants or diaspora or certain other interest groups that might send remittances to Sri Lanka. And in this geographic variation, what we saw was that in northern east, these two provinces, there were a lot more remittance receiving households than the migrant households. For instance, in Mullaitivu, there were like 0.5% households having a migrant in the district. But when it comes to remittance receiving households, there were close to 10% households had received remittances. So this huge disparity, almost 20 times disparity, shows that there is more remittances coming into the country than migrant workers going out of the country, at least in certain districts. So it's interesting to know this regional variation, because these remittances can used in a way to develop these regional economies and to understand why people are going and why remittances are coming in. There is some greater information going on, greater deficit going on in these regional economies.
And with that, we're going in for a short commercial break. Do stay tuned for more after these commercials. Welcome back to Biz in Focus. Joining us this evening is Dr. Bilesha Veeraratne, IPS Research Fellow and Head of Migration and Urbanization Research at the Institute of Policy Studies. So we were speaking of migration, Bilesha, and now with the fourth industrial revolution, many people have raised concerns that there's a high risk of losing jobs, especially in the overseas market. So how will this affect the local migration workforce?
So the fourth industrial revolution has a tendency to displace people who are working in routine sort of jobs that can be programmed into to be performed by automation or robots. So given that Sri Lankan migration scenario has a high component of lower skilled migrants, this is a concern for Sri Lanka, because most of the jobs that our low skilled migrant workers are doing can easily be robotized, can easily be automated. So if it is cost effective, the foreign employers will look to alternatives in this fourth industrial revolution rather than hiring lower skilled migrant workers. But having said that, we should also understand the composition of Sri Lankan migrant workers. Amongst our lower skilled migrant workers, still a large component are female domestic workers. So unlike regular lower skilled jobs that can be automated easily, female domestic workers perform jobs where you take care of a little child, or sort of a caregiver role at a household, cooking, cleaning jobs. So these tasks cannot be easily robotized or automated. Because there was an attempt in Japan where they tried to create a robot to clean a little child's room, but the robot couldn't do much because he couldn't understand the difference between a red sock and a pink sock and the different places it might be. So unlike a robot, a female domestic worker can execute these tasks much better. So despite having a threat that we might lose opportunities in this fourth industrial revolution, we also have an advantage, or we should capitalize on this human-only niche that Sri Lanka has, because majority of our female workers or majority of our low-skilled workers are performing these tasks associated with human-only jobs. So Sri Lanka can capitalize on this and work with other sending economies to leverage this human-only niche and maybe demand for better working conditions, because most of the time for lower skilled workers the concern is the bad working conditions in the destination countries. So with this human-only niche, I think it gives a good opportunity for countries like Sri Lanka to lobby together and demand for better working conditions and perhaps better pay also, and carve out a market for our workers. And another area that Sri Lanka could work on is these digital collar workers. In this fourth industrial revolution, there's a lot of data generated in the production processes, and they have to be analyzed and compared, and so not the higher skill jobs, but in the medium skill level or digital collar workers are required, because the amount of data that is produced has to be processed, analyzed. So people who are capable of handling this sort of medium level technical activities will have a high demand in the fourth industrial revolution. So Sri Lanka should also kind of look at upgrading our lower skilled workers with these skills so that they can apply for these digital collar work jobs. And there are some programs currently in Sri Lanka focusing on this sort of activities, where we have this recognition of prior learning, where informal learning that people have acquired over time is being certified by certain institutions in Sri Lanka. So that's a good drive, where Sri Lanka will still continue to have supply workers for these digital collar jobs if we can give them the proper recognition for the skills that they have acquired in informal ways, because traditional professional skills are acquired in academic institutions or in the traditional way, but these modern world technological jobs, they require skills that are acquired in non-traditional ways. So there has to be a mechanism in Sri Lanka to certify that they have these skills. So things are already in place. I think these have to be moved further so that we can benefit from the fourth industrial revolution with our migrant workers.
Bilesha, so Sri Lanka was recently upgraded to upper middle income status by the World Bank, but migration, skilled or non-skilled migration, still continues.
So at the average level, yes, we have passed the threshold and reached the upper middle income level, but there are certain pockets within the economy who do not have that much opportunities, especially when you look at these low skilled females seeking foreign employment. You see that they don't have much opportunities within Sri Lanka, because they say there is no way of earning income within the country, and there are very little job opportunities for their capacity, for their skill level. So they kind of, the only opportunity or the only option they have is foreign employment, because if you look at it from their point of view, these are most often mothers. So a mother would not leave a child and go abroad for 2 years and see the child in 2 years, once in 2 years, if she had an alternative way of staying around in the economy in Sri Lanka and spending more time with the child and earning an income. So this is because there aren't enough opportunities that these people go overseas. And another striking feature of these lower skill departures is that when it comes to female domestic workers, the average income that they earn overseas would be like 40,000 Sri Lankan rupees. And for a female domestic worker, working within Sri Lanka also, they have a capacity to earn about 30 to 40,000 Sri Lankan rupees. So why do they go overseas if they could earn the similar amount of money in Sri Lanka? So there aren't enough opportunities on the one hand, and the other thing they often say is that they cannot save enough if they stay in Sri Lanka, because this amount of money is not enough to meet ends. So when they go overseas, they say that they can save 99% of their salary. So these are the driving forces. So there are opportunities in Sri Lanka, but that's not sufficient. And for very certain skills groups, the opportunities are not sufficient to retain them in the country.
Thank you, Bilesha, for joining us this evening. Dr. Bilesha is the IPS Research Fellow and Head of Migration and Urbanization Research at the Institute of Policy Studies. And do stay tuned for more of the latest business updates after these commercial breaks. Sri Lanka's tea exports in the first half of this year have reached the highest ever 121.8 billion rupees, up by 7% from the earlier record established in the corresponding period of last year, despite a drop in volume. Forbes and Walker Tea Brokers said FOB value for the first half of 2019 was 839.46 rupees per kilo, up by 11.33 rupees per kilo from a year earlier. Cumulative exports between January to June 2019 amounted to 145.1 million kilos, down by 5.5% from the corresponding period of last year. The industry also witnessed a drop in volume in June, though marginally by 0.6 million kilos to 24.1 million kilos. In June, bulk tea exports showed an increase, while tea bags and packeted tea showed a decrease compared to the corresponding month of 2018. On a cumulative basis, tea bags, packeted tea together with bulk tea have shown a growth year-on-year. Forbes said Iraq has retained the number one spot as the largest importer of Sri Lankan tea for the period between January to June 2019, followed by Turkey, Russia and Iran. Further, Libya, China and Azerbaijan are some of the noteworthy importers, while it is also relevant that destinations such as India, Germany and USA have shown a significant growth in imports for the period under review when compared to the corresponding period of 2018. The dip in June is comparison to improvement in May 2019, when tea exports gained by 3.5 million kilos to 26.6 million kilos when compared with a year earlier. According to the State Information Office, Sri Lanka's Cabinet of Ministers approved a proposal by the Ministry of Plantation Industries to reduce the levy imposed on tea exports to 3 rupees a kilo. The levy was imposed to raise funds to promote Ceylon tea globally, with a long-delayed marketing campaign set to start in September in Russia, one of the biggest markets for the island's main agricultural export. The statement said the decision to reduce the tea export levy was taken considering rising costs faced by exporters who already pay a variety of other taxes. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka expects to resume Ceylon tea exports to Iran under a special barter agreement between the two countries by the end of next month. According to the Ministry of Plantation Industries, Ceylon tea will be exported to Iran to settle a due amount of $240 million in exchange for the country's oil imports before US sanctions. Under the expected deal, Sri Lanka will be able to export tea worth up to $5 million per month, and relevant discussions have already been conducted with Iranian counterparts. The opportunity to export tea under this agreement will only be offered to the Tea Board, recommended and registered tea exporters who performed well over the past 3 years. Headline inflation as measured by the year-on-year change in the National Consumer Price Index decreased to 2.1% in June 2019 from 3.5% in May 2019 due to the high base prevailed in the corresponding month of the previous year. Meanwhile, in June 2019, both year-on-year food and non-food inflation decreased to negative 2.9% and 6.2% from a negative 0.4% and 6.7% respectively. The change in the NCPI measured on an annual average basis remained unchanged at 2% in June 2019. When monthly change is considered, the NCPI increased by 0.4% in June 2019, with the increases observed in the prices of the items in both food and non-food categories. Within the food category, prices of fresh fish, big onions, green chilies, red onions and rice recorded increases. In addition, within the non-food category, prices of the items in transport and restaurants and hotels subcategories increased during the month. And that's a wrap of Biz in Focus. Thank you for watching. Good night.